Welcome to the first of our Techies Go Green webinar highlights, where Daniel Curry, Senior Net Zero Lead with Transport for London, will talk about TfL's journey to net zero. This is an insightful and timely webinar exploring how one of the world's largest and most complex transport networks is accelerating its journey to net zero and growing its energy independence.
So I'm Dan Curry. I lead the net zero team here at TfL and been working for a number of years driving this agenda within the organization. So I don't know, Francis, I didn't join the first bit, there's done an intro, but just really briefly, my role is about setting the organizational strategy and for decarbonisation, clearly, and then developing projects that reduce carbon and cost. And today, I'm really going to talk about our science-based targets and what we're doing to achieve those, both now and in the years to come. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There's quite a lot to get through. So luckily for you guys, hopefully, bear with me, and there's an opportunity for questions at the end. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with Transport for London, or TfL as I'm going to commonly refer throughout the presentation, but probably not the breadth of our operations. So TfL was formed in the year 2000, and that was bringing together multiple forms of transport operated within the capital into a single organisation, so under one umbrella. And ultimately, we, as the organisation, are accountable to the Greater London Authority and therefore the Mayor of London. So since 2016, that has been Sadiq Khan. So it started smaller, obviously, and over the last few years, we've taken on responsibility for more rail services and other services across the capital. And in the case of the Elizabeth line, which was formerly known as Crossrail through the construction phase, we are also building more services as well. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see all the major modes which we now operate, some of which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So London Underground and the iconic red buses. So that's the two logos. Top left is the blue one is London Underground. The one underneath it conveniently says buses is clearly buses. Now we refer to those as roundels. So you're probably aware of those, but you're probably not quite so familiar with other parts of our operation. So things like we operate 580 kilometres of roads within the capital, along with associated traffic lights and signals. And I'm going to throw a few more stats at you actually before I move on, just to give you a sense of scale for the rest of the presentation. So we've got roughly 9,000 buses operating on a day-to-day, 550 tube trains, over 1,000 kilometres of track across our rail modes. And to support those services, we have, give or take, 2,500 properties or buildings. So in terms of people, that asset base supports approximately 9 million journeys on a day-to-day basis, and an even greater number across the wider London area. So to do so, we directly employ about 28,000 people, but much more broadly than that, support tens of thousands more jobs, whether that's directly through the operation of our franchise services, which I'll come on to a little bit later, or through our supply chain, such as teams keeping services maintained and delivering upgrades. So if you could skip forward a slide, please. So with that backdrop, it's no surprise to anybody here, I'm sure, that our impact and therefore influence on carbon is pretty significant, and we've got therefore a large role to play in decarbonising the capital. So there are three main sources of our emissions, which I'll go through in turn. So the first is that blue bit at the top. So that's what we call our operational carbon footprint, and that is the fossil fuels and electricity we and companies operating services on our behalf consume. It totals about 800,000 kilotons of carbon annually. So yeah, just to make sure I'm super clear, that's the blue section at the top. And then moving down to the left, the second area is the footprint associated with our infrastructure and supply chain. So this is purchased goods and services, construction and maintenance, and it's about the same size as our day-to-day operations in terms of impact. The final piece of this jigsaw is London's wider transport emissions. So this is things like the takeoff and landing of flights at airports, along with private vehicles and network rail services that we don't directly operate ourselves. Now, I appreciate that's been super fast. Don't worry, I'm going to go into more detail on the next slide. If you could flick forward one, please. Taking those same groupings and colours from the previous slide and overlaying our science-based targets, you basically end up here. So starting from the left-hand side, you can see our largest source of Scope 3 emissions, which are from our infrastructure and supply chain at about 800 kilotons of carbon. This includes everything from the concrete and steel we use in new projects to the emissions associated with things like IT systems, data centres, contracts for, let me give an example, things like the uniform contract within London Underground. So, the clothes that people are wearing on their backs on the day to day. We're working hard to reduce emissions from these sources, but this won't be the focus of the presentation today. So moving to the right to the first blue box titled TfL's Operator Services. This is the it's about 450 kilotons, I should say. And instead of employing staff directly here, these services are operated by other companies on our behalf, and thus the emissions associated with their operation are the responsibility of those companies. So this includes things like the red buses, London Overground. And clearly, although another company actually buys the electricity or fuels for their operation, they wouldn't be running we didn't have contracts with them to do so. So we've got a significant amount of control over how these services are run, and therefore the emissions from this source too. And the vast proportion of emissions from this category are from buses, which I'll come on to a little bit later. We've made significant progress to decarbonise that. So next up, moving to the right, we've got TfL Direct Energy. So that's the directly purchased energy and fuel. So this is all the gas, diesel, petrol, electricity we buy ourselves, the lion's share of which is consumed by London Underground. And on that note, we are the largest single electricity consumer in London and the top 10 within the UK. And then finally, not technically our emissions are the aforementioned wider London sources, which are by far the largest at over 5 megatons. So we don't have science-based targets coming to covering this because they aren't technically ours. But I am going to pause here just for a second because I think it's important to state before we go into the main bit of the presentation, which is going to be those two blue boxes in the middle. One of the most important things we could do as an organization is to ensure that walking, cycling, public transport trips to continue to increase and strive towards our target for 80% of journeys to be made by sustainable modes by 2041. We've made really good progress here. So walking and cycling makes up about 30%, about a third of trips. And that's partly been achieved through spending a lot of money, improving facilities and safety on London's roads, but there's clearly more to do. Other things we've done, keeping to the right-hand side, London's wider transport, are things like the ultra-low emission zone, which you'll probably be aware of, and expanded that to cover Greater London. And this has obviously changed the mix of vehicles in the city, and probably the most pronounced benefit here is really on the air quality side of things. So there was some research that was released at the end of last year by King's College London that estimated that had the mayor taken no action when he came into power in 2016, it would have taken about 193 years for TfL to meet its legal limits for air quality. But that was actually achieved in about 9, which is clearly a huge success. And when you think that prior to this, about 4,000 premature deaths were attributed to toxic air or air quality in London. This is clearly extremely important. So I'm not going to dwell on it anymore. To sum up, I guess what I'm saying is our public transport offer in London is intrinsic to reducing emissions. It's intrinsic to encouraging sustainable growth within the capital, and quite frankly, to make the capital city function on the day to day. Obviously, everyone would be in cars, and it would be complete gridlock and chaos. But there's obviously more we can do to remove carbon from our operations and supply chain. And as such, we agreed and published our science-based targets last year. So if you can just click one, Kajal, that'd be great. So we've set targets covering basically the orangey yellow box and the two blue boxes in the middle, as you probably understand now from this slide. So to touch briefly on the targets, again, not going to dwell too much on these, but for scope 1 and 2, which refers to our directly purchased fuel and electricity, so what we actually buy as TfL ourselves, the TfL Direct Energy box is the one you're looking at in the middle there. We set a target to reduce emissions by about 90% or by 90% by 2022. And then for our scope 3, which is a recap, is that orange bit on the left-hand side, and the TfL's operator services, we've got targets to reduce that element by 45% by 2030 and 90% by 2040. So these targets we view as being pretty stretching, but attainable. So from here on, the focus is on our operational emissions. So basically all those services, all the logos you saw earlier, whether we procure their fuel electricity directly or not. So in the middle, we've got build up of our emissions from operations. So buses are the largest share, over 50% or about 50%. Electricity makes up the next largest portion at about 45%, and that's used largely for traction purposes. So non-technical speak, that's basically moving trains around within the capital. And then a not insignificant portion is used within our buildings and supporting assets as well. The last 5% are direct fossil fuel-based emissions from gas, petrol, diesel, and a bit of oil, which are used within our fleet vehicles and buildings at the very top there. So those slices get ever smaller to the point that you can't see them. So what are we doing against each of those areas? So I'm sure it's just no surprise to anybody here that particularly on the vehicle side, for buses, we've been ensuring that we transition to ZE, predominantly electric vehicles, and then moving up the left-hand side of this slide to fleet vehicles, which includes about 800 or so vans, which are supporting our services on a day-to-day basis. The dial-a-ride fleet, which is the adapted minibuses, as well as a small number of HGVs and specialist vehicles, to name but a few. Again, we're going in a very similar direction of moving as quickly as possible to ZE and predominantly battery electric. So moving on to the electricity, which is the big blue bar, and on the traction side of things, which is a recap, is the largest where most of our electricity goes. We're procuring more energy efficient trains whenever we can. So the new Piccadilly line rolling stock that will enter service in the relatively near future, next year or two. They're more energy efficient than the previous, and when we deliver major upgrades like that, that's a real opportunity to try and do so in an energy neutral manner. So we don't always manage it, but ideally we aim to increase services, but doing so without actually increasing the amount of energy we're drawing from predominantly the national grid. And for buildings, which is the gas, a small amount of oil, and along with the remaining electricity, the plan is on the slide really. So we're trying to make sure we don't install new gas assets. So when kit reaches end of life, we make sure it's usually a heat pump whenever possible. We deliver as much energy efficiency with a positive financial case as we can. We maximize the amount of directly connected renewables within the London area, and talk a bit more about that later, and Adrian will come in on that point too. And then finally, with the electricity that we'll need to purchase from grid, which is always going to be the case, we're never going to generate enough electricity, well, certainly not with current technology, going to generate enough electricity, green electricity within the London area. So we're always going to be reliant on the national grid. We want to buy that energy in a meaningful way. And for us, that means entering into power purchase agreements, which are relationships with energy providers, where as part of that contract, they go and build new assets, whether that be wind, solar, or other in the future on the UK grid. So yeah, it's not directly feeding us, but it still contributes to UK-wide decarbonisation. So I guess the question to answer on this slide is like, where are we on this journey? So rather than going through line by line, I thought I'd share some key achievements over the past year or so. So we've made a lot of progress on buses. This is an old article from last year. We've now got well over 2,500 buses that are zero emission, which gives us one of the largest ZE fleets in Western Europe. All but about 20 of those are battery electric. The remainder are predominantly battery electric. We've got about 20 or so hydrogen in our fleet. And the challenge really will be for us to keep moving at pace in this agenda. And I might talk a little bit about that later. So taking forward one, last year we signed our first power purchase agreement, which I just sort of talked you through what those were. But off the back of that contract being signed, the supplier will build a new solar farm within Essex. We'll supply about 5% of our total electricity consumption over a 15-year contract. So to give that some sort of scale, that's enough power for about 29,000 or so homes. So as a recap, that's not directly flowing to our assets, but that will be coming through the national grid. And we've got a plan to go back out to market for more PPAs in the future. This was pretty long procurement, quite novel, I think, for the public sector, and there were a lot of lessons learned through that procurement, which will apply to the future tranches. Clicking forward again, please. Thanks. So buildings wise, so we've been lucky enough to receive significant funding from the government's public sector decarbonisation scheme. So this is grant funding that assists people like us, public sector organisations, with the cost of removing fossil fuels. So a major milestone was met just before Christmas, where the first depot building, so that's a big open shed where we do maintenance, was completed. And that included installing renewables, included efficiency, and then installing heat pumps, and actually changing quite considerably the way we heat the building. So before we had big blown air, sort of gas-fired heating for the big shed where the trams are in, as I said, on a pretty much daily basis, particularly overnight. And so as soon as the doors opened, all that hot air would be released back out into the world. And what we've done is by moving to infrared heaters, we're actually heating the person rather than the space. And it's been one of the really good things about this is that actually the feedback from staff has been super positive. They're actually warmer and more comfortable than they were before. So a bit of a win. So that's a kind of test case for what we might do elsewhere in the future. And then final example on here is bringing it back to renewables. And a few weeks back, we were excited to announce that we'd signed a contract with SSE Energy Solutions, who we'll work with in partnership to deliver solar installs within the London area. So rather than this being on UK grid, this will directly feed into the London Underground network. And we're really excited to get going on this project. And Adrian's going to talk a little bit more about this later in the webinar. So just worth noting, these are just some of the things we've been up to. Some of the things I have somewhat noteworthy, I suppose. Other things which are, I guess, a bit less sexy, like energy efficiency, I haven't touched on. So this isn't the full breadth of what we've been up to. So where does all that get us, really? The key headline, I think, for me here is on the left-hand side of the slide, where we estimate, and we're on track for, I should say, our operational emissions being about 88% what they were in 2015 by 2030. And that's something we're super proud of. As I previously mentioned, we've got our science-based targets that are basically, yeah, they're aligned to this trajectory, and we're broadly on track, but we do recognise that there will be changes to science-based targets in the future, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative as well. And this, we may have to rebaseline at a later date with to basically take in those changes. So moving on to, I think, what is my final slide here, which is about challenges and opportunities. So I think, like all organizations, carbon reduction is just one of the many priorities of our business. For us, safety and reliability are absolutely top priority, both for our staff and customers. But we've been working on basically compiling a lot of information. So if we want to spend £1 to reduce carbon in London, we're trying to develop a really evidence-based approach for where that will drive the biggest benefit. And this is hard because that benefit could come from, say, installing an LED, it could be replacing a gas boiler, but it could be working with our supply chain to reduce carbon in projects, concrete, steel, or it might be improving our public transport offer to encourage mode shift. So it's incredibly diverse. And I'm not saying we are perfect at this, but it's something which we're working quite hard to get better at. I thought I'd mention this because I think this is probably something that's experienced by different companies across different sectors. And I imagine those challenges are different in different sectors, but it feels like an area that we could collaborate more on in the future. A very common and obvious one that's related pretty intrinsically to prioritization is money. Earlier this year, we published our first 4-year business plan since COVID. So previous to that, we've been sort of one year kind of government deals, and there's no way to run a business. So we're very fortunate to now have that, and it's allowed us to then be a bit more certain about our trajectory for carbon to 2030 as well. But just to say here that our challenges aren't just technical in nature, and if we had more funding, we could go further on certain things. So power upgrades, on the one hand, we're fortunate on this one. So London Underground has its own private power network that's connected to National Grid via 8 bulk supply points, is what we call them, but basically just big grid connections. And that's, as I previously mentioned, the vast majority of the electricity necessary to run our London Underground services comes through those 8 points. And although this power network isn't limitless, there has been some spare capacity, and that's allowed us to start decarbonising our buildings and fleet. But as we continue on this path through to 2030 and beyond, we're going to get to the end of that capacity, and we're going to have to work with the DNOs, and they're already doing so to do grid reinforcement and make sure that we can keep moving at pace. So skills, knowledge, and experience. We're pretty lucky actually in TfL now that we've got a good sized multidisciplinary team who are focused on this agenda. So it's a team of strategy people, engineers, project managers, commercial, sponsorship, and been really driving the work forward. But when people inevitably leave and and progress their careers in other ways, we do find it quite hard to recruit at some points, and we know our suppliers are finding the same. And I think with many organizations setting 2030, 2035, 2040 targets, the dash for decarbonisation is spreading us a bit thin. So it's certainly something that we all need to work hard on, and along with government as well. Just another one on the skills, knowledge, and experience. I mentioned the renewable procurement from grid and the power purchase agreement stuff, and that was a long, quite challenging procurement, which had a successful end to it. But we recognised that the market we were going out to, energy companies, were not used to public sector procurement, and there were a lot of hoops you have to jump through. We simplified that as much as possible, and I'm sure Adrian could say something on this later, hopefully nicely as well when it comes to his section. But it can be complicated. So we spent a lot of time and effort with the supply chain trying to make sure that they fully understood what the requirements were to enable that outcome. And we'll have to do the same in future, and we'll build on that in years to come with future procurements. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to touch on the last couple of these a bit more quickly. So data, it's probably a common for everyone, but you can't manage what you can't measure. And we need to improve metering and asset data across our business, and then do more to make use of that data in an accessible way. But then flipping that to the positive side of things as well, we could do more with the data we actually have. And that's going to be a focus for the next few years, is really get on top of utilities management and making sure that's baked in to what people have to do on a day-to-day basis. And by doing so, just to link these together, we think, particularly in energy efficiency space, there are still significant cost savings to be had. We've done some of the low-hanging fruit, but there's definitely more to go at. But to really realize that benefit, you've got to create a carbon culture. I mentioned 28,000 people just that we employ directly. We've trained about 6,500 now of those to be carbon literate. So that's a full day training course. And it's really paid dividends, that it does feel fundamentally different to sort of 3 or 4 years ago. And people coming forward with their own ideas to decarbonise. And they have to do so actually as part of the training. They have to pledge what they will do within their day job. And then we've been tracking those. But it's something that other organizations might want to consider doing too, if you want to make meaningful progress on this. So I need to stop talking probably. So that's it from me. Hopefully that was useful. It's covered our science-based targets, what we're doing. And I will hand back to Francis at this point and have a drink.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. Well deserved as well. And that worked pretty well, even with the technical difficulties. So thanks for bearing with us there.